here for joining the Washington Policy Center Young Professionals for this event addressing climate change, governments, or markets. I'd also like to extend a tremendous thank you to TVW. TVW is a longtime partner of Washington Policy Center. We're thrilled to have them join us and to broadcast this event to a larger audience. My name is Marissa Gaston. I am the WPC YP Director. Quick overview of Washington Policy Center. We are a state-based free market think tank with 7 research centers that engage across issues and focus on developing solutions that emphasize good policy. The Young Professionals program stewards our 18 to 39-year-old members with the aim of creating the next generation of free market leaders here in Washington State. We do this by educating, engaging, and empowering our members. We have college clubs across the state. We've recently done an event on homelessness and housing. We also record a monthly podcast that has recently featured a discussion on housing with a state representative, another discussion on the capital gains income tax with WPC's Director for the Center of Government Reform, Jason Mercier. This month's discussion on our podcast will cover environment in keeping with the theme here, specifically on land usage and forestry. So I encourage you to check that out. YPs also have a robust and growing social media presence, which I hope that you'll explore to get an even better sense of how dynamic and growing our community and our program are. Follow us on Facebook and check out our Instagram at WPC_Young Professionals. Another really great example of our rich community are our monthly book clubs, which are available to our silver members and up. In April, we read The Millionaire Next Door, which is on personal finance, entrepreneurship, and wealth building. This month for May, next month rather, for May, we are reading Freedom and Virtue, the Conservative Libertarian Debate, which is published by ISI. So I'm very much looking forward to that. Book clubs are one of my favorite parts of the YP program. To access these great activities like the book club, please consider joining or renewing a silver membership with the YPs for only $35 a year, or a gold membership, which includes access to our mentorship program at $100 a year, in addition to an incredible and diverse group of people and getting free and discounted tickets to in-person events starting this summer, as well as to our annual dinner. We'll be making a contribution to a really unique and important voice for free markets in Washington State. So finally, I'd like to thank you again for being here, and thank you to our moderator and to our panelists who will be introduced shortly, and I can't wait to get this discussion rolling. But first, I would like to introduce the president of the Gonzaga YP Club, which is hosting this event, Olivia Johnston. She is from Spokane, Washington, and is a senior at Gonzaga, graduating with a business degree, a bachelor's degree in business administration and an English minor. In the fall, she'll be pursuing a Juris Doctorate at the University of Idaho, and she's been involved with young professionals for the past 4 years. So, Olivia, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Marissa. I really appreciate it. I just want to take a moment to say how grateful I am to be a part of the Young Professionals the past 4 years in my time at Gonzaga. It's been very empowering, engaging, enlightening, and so I'm really happy to be here and be a part of this event tonight. I just wanted to take a quick moment to say thank you to my officers, Connor Gilbert, Iola Humphrey, and Joe Strecker. They've been a huge part in getting this event together, so thank you to all of you. And I have the honor tonight of introducing our moderator, Maya Espinoza. So in addition to her work as the communications manager for Washington Policy Center, Maya is the executive director and founder of the Center for Latino Leadership, a civic engagement, education-oriented nonprofit with a mission to empower, inspire, and equip the Latino community of Washington to engage in state and local government. Maya has served on the Race and Ethnicity Student Data Task Force at the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction as part of the Opportunity Gap Oversight and Accountability Committee. As the legislative liaison to the Washington State Commission on Hispanic Affairs and as a communications associate for the State Senate 2014 Majority Coalition Caucus. We are so happy to have you here, Maya, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you, Marissa, and thanks to all of you YP members for tuning in this evening for this, what is sure to be exciting debate. I am going to turn it over quickly to introduce our panelists. We'll take 3 to 4 minutes of opening remarks from each panelist. This is a time to lay out your policy approach to climate change. Please briefly address whether you favor governments or markets when formulating solutions for climate change and why. I'd like to start with Christopher Barnard. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Maya, and hi, everyone. It's great to be here with you today. My name is Chris Barnard, and I'm the Policy Director for the American Conservation Coalition, an organization founded in 2017 to give young conservatives and libertarians a voice on environmental issues. And as you can probably tell from this, I tend to favor a market approach to the issue of climate change. But the interesting thing is that it wasn't always this way. For as long as I can remember, I've considered myself right-leaning, but I always said, except on the environment. The environment is the one issue where I consider myself left-wing. Why? Well, similar to many young people, I considered climate change a problem caused by free markets, and one that only heavy-handed government policy could solve. But then I started reading into this and learning more about the issue at university and beyond. And I can tell you I was genuinely shocked to learn more about this, and not just how ineffective and slow government policy is, but how in many ways it does the exact opposite of what it claims to be doing. The worst case studies of environmental chaos come from big government socialist countries such as the Soviet Union and Venezuela, and even in non-socialist countries like America, government policy on environmental issues has been quite frankly counterproductive. And I'll give you a few examples of what I mean by this, both in terms of market distortion and the regulatory impact of government policy. First, talking about market distortion, around the world, every single minute, governments still distribute $10 million in fossil fuel subsidies. $10 million every single minute. Of the top 50 polluting companies in the world, which together emit 70% of emissions, 49 are owned, subsidized, or partly owned by central governments. Only one is fully private. In the United States, traditional energy companies have a huge advantage under our legal code by being classified as master limited partnerships, which allows them to raise money as a corporation without paying the corporate tax that businesses typically do. Clean energy companies don't benefit from this same legal structure, giving enormous legal advantage to fossil fuel companies. These are just a few of the examples of how governments around the world and also in America have heavily skewed the market in favor of fossil fuels and disadvantaged clean energy technologies. And even when it's not outright picking winners and losers, the heavy-handed approach of government regulatory impact on the clean energy industry. And so I'll give you a few examples of what I mean by this. Studies show that nuclear regulations introduced in the 1970s increased the quantity of concrete needed for these projects by 27%, electrical cable by 36%, steel by 41%, and piping by 50%. This has dramatically hindered innovation in the nuclear industry and keeps pushing up the price of nuclear so that it's uncompetitive with other energy sources. The Jones Act of 1920, a protectionist maritime law that Biden recently re-emphasized his support for, has all but stymied the US offshore wind industry by mandating that the transportation of merchandise between US ports is carried out solely by American-owned, built, and flagged vessels. Well, unfortunately for offshore wind, there are no ships in the US big enough to install the necessary turbines and infrastructure. Other environmental regulations, such as the National Environmental Policy Act, are a huge burden on new infrastructure projects, including many clean energy projects. NEPA adds an estimated cost of $4.2 million per project and takes an average of 4.5 years to complete the review before the project can even get off the ground. Hundreds of projects are delayed by years or are halted altogether simply because they become too expensive as a result of NEPA regulation. And so these are just a few of the examples that open my eyes to the reality of government policy on the environment. And what I realized is that the private sector, from oil companies to tech companies to big banks to Wall Street investors, are actually the ones looking for ways and innovations to tackle climate change. Google and Microsoft and Apple and other big companies have all made climate pledges that are better and even bigger than the most ambitious government plans. Why? Because consumers and market forces are driving this. In a competitive marketplace, companies respond to price signals, and entrepreneurs continually search for promising new opportunities. Market pressures to attract customers, incentivize improvements in operations, investment, and resource use. And this is part of the reason why in the last decade alone, the cost of solar has come down 88% and wind has come down 71%. This is also why states that have more competitive energy markets tend to have greater innovation and adoption of clean energy sources, as well as lower prices. Of course, none of this means that the government has absolutely no role in helping fight climate change. It does, but it must work with the private sector rather than against it. So my preference when it comes to climate policy is to reform these burdensome regulations, tear down barriers to competition and free trade, and support early stage innovation through targeted funding and our national laboratory system. So in a general point of view, that's my view on climate policy and why I personally have learned to prefer markets over governments when it comes to these policies.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris. And I appreciate you staying on task here with briefly describing whether you favor governments or markets when it comes to formulating solutions for climate change. So Steve, if I could have you introduce yourself, Stephen Gann, please introduce yourself and answer the same question. 3 to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Steve Gann. I am a climate scientist. I worked at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory for 28 years, and I also volunteer with Citizens Climate Lobby. I lead the Tri-Cities chapter of CCL. In January 2019, 3,000 economists, 27 of them Nobel laureates, 4 of them former chairs of the Federal Reserve, 15 former chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors, and 2 former Treasury secretaries, published a statement in the Wall Street Journal concluding, a carbon tax offers the most cost-effective lever to reduce carbon emissions at the scale and speed that is necessary. Now, the justification for a price on carbon is that it accounts for impacts of fossil fuel emissions that consumers are not presently paying. It corrects what economists call a market failure to account for negative externalities. It allows a market, not the government, to find substitutes for fossil fuels after accounting for those impacts. But the role of government in establishing, enforcing, and collecting the carbon price is essential. While some countries have embraced carbon pricing as a climate policy, the US has not yet done so. Why not? Opposition from fossil fuel companies has certainly played a role, but the American Petroleum Institute has recently stated public support for market solutions to climate change. But still, there is opposition, and it's coming from both conservatives and progressives. Some progressives oppose carbon taxes because they don't trust market mechanisms and because carbon taxes hit the poor hardest. Some conservatives oppose carbon taxes because taxes take cash from the economy and grow the size of government. These objections are met with carbon dividends. When all revenue from a carbon tax is immediately distributed in equal shares to all people, government growth is minimized. And when people spend their carbon dividends, it stimulates the economy, creating new jobs. The carbon dividend means the most to the poor. 99% of the lowest income quintile either get more from their dividend than the carbon tax costs them, or they break even. The carbon dividend also creates durable political will for a far higher price on carbon and associated higher dividends, hundreds of dollars per ton of CO2, or dollars per gallon of gasoline, which will drive down carbon emissions as people, businesses, and utilities make decisions based on a predictable climate policy. Carbon leakage to other countries, that is, when manufacturers in a country with a carbon price move their operations to countries without a carbon price, that carbon leakage can be addressed with fees on the carbon content of imports from countries without a carbon price, with a revenue given to the exporters of energy-intensive trade-exposed goods. Such a border adjustment will motivate domestic manufacturing to stay and other countries to also price carbon. The carbon fee and dividend policy is advocated by Citizens Climate Lobby, which I volunteer for, and by the Climate Leadership Council, which is comprised of accomplished Republicans and a variety of large businesses, including ExxonMobil. It's embodied in the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act of Congress, H.R. 2307. That legislation is quite aggressive, with the carbon fee increasing $10 per ton per year, targeting a 30% reduction in US CO2 emissions in 5 years and net zero emissions by 2050. Such emissions reductions, if followed by other nations in response to the border adjustment, will spare the world great pain and suffering.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. Next, I'd like to turn it over to Washington Policy's own Todd Myers.
Thank you, Maya. So I'm Todd Myers. I'm the Environmental Director at the Washington Policy Center. And just to let people know right up front, the position of the Washington Policy Center is that there is risk from climate change. I think I may disagree with Steve or Eric about how serious that risk is, but I personally am carbon neutral and invest in projects that reduce CO2 emissions. I buy what are called RECs, which is renewable energy credits, so that my electricity, which in Washington State is already pretty clean, is completely clean. So I do things personally to make sure that I am reducing my risk. And that, I think, is how we are going to make the best progress on reducing CO2 emissions and addressing the risks that do exist from climate change. And in fact, the more serious you think climate change is, the more you want to require effectiveness and accountability for results. And that is, I think, the fundamental difference between projects and approaches that are led by government and politicians and approaches that are led by the market. And using technology created in the market and tying it to the personal incentives to do more with less and to reduce what it costs us to use energy and electricity is how we're going to make the most progress. Let me make it clear that in Washington State, our current policy, which is primarily government-led, is failing. Washington State is very likely to miss its 2020 CO2 targets, as is Seattle, as is Spokane. King County recently announced a new climate strategy for 2030, but as of 2018, which is the most recent data that we have, they were only 4% of the way toward meeting their target, CO2 reduction target. The reason I bring this up is how many people realize this and what politicians are held accountable for those failures. Certainly not Governor Inslee, who has been in office for 8 years and promised that this would be his top priority, not the city council members or the mayor of Seattle, not in Spokane, not in King County. All of these politicians talk repeatedly about how important it is to fight climate change, and yet they repeatedly fail. So the more serious you think climate change is, the more frustrated you should be with our current approach and government-led a way of doing things. And I'll just give you a couple of quick examples. In 2006, the mayor of Seattle, Greg Nichols at the time, wanted cities across the country to join what he called the U.S. Conference of Mayors Climate Protection Agreement, where they said that in 2012, those cities would hit the CO2 reduction targets in the Kyoto Protocol, which was the predecessor of the Paris Accords. So dozens of cities in Washington State across the country signed on to it. When 2012 rolled around, I started calling all of those cities in Washington State and asked them, did you meet your targets? A third of them said, yes, we've tracked it, but we failed. 2/3 of them, though, didn't even track it. And yet again, nobody was held accountable. So that's the problem with government approaches, is that even if you care, even if you think climate change is a crisis, and you think that government needs to set strong targets, those targets are often not followed. The market does provide an alternative, both in terms of empowering people, using the incentives that we all have to become more efficient and do more with less, and with the technology that is available. And I'll just give you 2 quick examples. The first is the smart thermostat. So Nest and Ecobee are 2 smart thermostats that you can get that help you keep your house the temperature that you want in a more efficient way using artificial intelligence. Right now, people pay the same amount, basically the same amount, whether they use electricity at 3 p.m. or at peak at 6 p.m. But really what we want to do is that we want to shift demand when people use electricity to 3 p.m. when the sun is out and there's solar electricity, as opposed to 6 or 7 p.m. when there's much less sun out and what we have to use is natural gas or coal. Smart thermostats do that and they save you money. That's the way we're going to do this. And I'll give you one more quick example, which is that in Washington state, transportation emissions are our #1 source of CO2 emissions. But in Seattle, there are companies that did car sharing so that you don't have to own a car, but you can find a car that you can drive around when transit is not an option. And what they found is that car sharing actually reduced by several thousand the number of vehicles in Seattle. That's not only more efficient, it reduces CO2 emissions, and it reduces traffic. All of these things are positive, and we are only just beginning to recognize the power of these sort of personal incentives and personal empowerment. That, I think, is the fundamental choice between free markets and government. Free markets empower people using the incentives they have and hold you accountable if you don't reduce energy use. In politics, that's not the case. Politicians are not held accountable for failure. They are judged based on their promises, not their results. And that's why I think ultimately the market is going to do a better job of solving this problem than political solutions.
Thank you, Todd. And I, for one, am already impressed at the diversity that we have represented here of thoughts and opinions. So with that in mind, I'd love to introduce next Eric DePlace. Please introduce yourself and tell us why you favor governments or markets.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Eric DePlace. I'm with Sightline Institute, where I lead the center's work on climate and energy. I also have a working interest in climate policy across the country, and particularly on gas issues in the East. I'll spare you the resume for now, but suffice it to say, I think this is I wanted to say I'm not a conservative, not by any stretch of the imagination, but I wanted to really commend Washington Policy Center and sort of the conservative movement in general for starting a conversation like this. This is fascinating. This is good. This is exactly the sort of thing that we need to be doing. I'd sort of forgotten that progressives and conservatives weren't talking anymore until I got an email from Todd, and he reminded me that, in fact, there is a way to have a conversation. That's not to say that we're going to come out of this with complete agreement, but I am gratified to at least play a small role in a conversation like this. I'll say too that I agree with 30 or 40% of what Todd and Chris said. There's a good chunk of overlap there. But I do want to sort of, for a moment, get a little philosophical with everybody and call into question the whole nature of the debate that we're having between government and markets. There is not such a thing, in my view, as a market that is not itself a product pretty explicitly of government. You can find that anywhere in the world, from Denmark to Venezuela to Australia. You can go around almost anywhere. And what you find, in my view, this is the mental model that I have for it, and I think it's not a terrible one, is that markets are, in some sense, wooden puppets on marionette strings that are operated by government. But the puppeteer is blind drunk and not paying close attention, and occasionally gets smacked across the face by his own puppet. And so, they are inextricably bound up in one another. And this has been true historically from time immemorial. There's not such a thing as a market that is free from, basic things like how do you enforce a contract? How do you enforce weights and measures? What is the value of currency in exchange? Blah, 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 blah. I'll spare you kind of the dorm room 101 version of economics as I would have it. But maybe not. Maybe I won't spare you entirely. Suffice it to say that I don't think we can really approach this question without acknowledging that there are very significant failures in both government and in the market, and that the right way to rectify that is to take a look systematically across the two and to try to identify points of failure and to correct for those. I think Chris did a really excellent job of identifying some of the signal failures in the way that government has subsidized, and it's not an accident, has very intentionally subsidized the fossil fuel industry. Great, let's address that and get rid of it. Absolutely agree that is a failure of government that manifests itself in the market. I also agree that there are bizarre holdovers from decades ago. The Jones Act is a great one. I'm so glad Chris brought that one up. I mean, why on earth do we have a Jones Act? I have no idea. Great, let's get rid of that. And I would suggest that I think Todd said a few things that really resonate with me too, which is that we do need some level of accountability, but that accountability for making aspirational climate targets and then failing to reach them ought to extend to those politicians who don't bother to acknowledge the reality of climate change or to make any aspirational targets or make any plans whatsoever to address the threat of climate change. I think as Todd suggested, we may have some differences of opinion or belief about what the risks of climate change are. I think the risks are pretty profound. But nonetheless, I hope that there's some shared agreement that climate change is real, it's actually happening, it's caused by humans, and that it will have impacts on us. And so the question then is, are we holding accountable the systems around us? And principally, that's the way that government then influences and enforces the market. That being said, there are lots of other ways in which I think the market, whatever that is, whatever organism of or extension or marionette controlled organism that is from government, fails signally. And the easiest analogies probably are with fossil fuels. They're relatively simple. You can point to vast stretches of public land. So this is government-owned land that is leased for coal, oil, and gas drilling, then subsidized, then run on highly regulated railroads or through highly regulated pipelines, sold to highly regulated utilities that then create electricity that we burn in our homes. All of that is the enmeshment and entanglement of government and markets together. And so the right way, from my perspective, is to address those things systematically, not based on which category we think they fall into, but based on how stupid they are. Now, I'll wrap up in just a second, because I will say I love markets. I think markets are fantastic. And if we had an enforceable, science-based way to address climate change, I would happily quit my job and go do something else. I will go ride my bicycle off into the sunset and not worry about stuff like this anymore. I don't believe that we don't have one now. That's obvious. I don't believe we'll ever have one. And I don't think, frankly, that conservatives have anything like a plan to obtain one. And so what I'm doing with my career is the second best option, the third best option, the fourth best. I'm probably way down the list of my favorite options. I'm down into like kind of the mediocre approaches to climate change, which is basically to beat up on the fossil fuel industry. That's actually a pretty successful endeavor. We can punish them through lots of market mechanisms, including through the investment community. There are lots of regulatory red tape we can throw in their way, all kinds of sand we can throw in the gears. And so until we get an enforceable, science-based approach to climate change, and I don't care if it's market or government, but it's got to be something. Until then, I'm going to settle for really suboptimal approaches, because I don't think we have one. I don't think we're likely to have one soon. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks and thank everybody again for tuning in this evening. I appreciate the chance to be here.
I love your optimism, Eric. Thanks so much. Nice to meet all of the panelists tonight. So I will start by kicking off our first question here. But before I do that, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to get your questions. If you do have a question, feel free to send it over to Marissa, our YP director. Her email address, you can reach her directly, is mgaston, that's MGASTON, at washingtonpolicy.org. And if I said that too fast or you couldn't find a pen, just go to the WPC website, which is washingtonpolicy.org. Look under staff, look for Marissa, you'll find her email there. So with that, I'm going to kick off the first question, and it'll be a surprise who I asked to answer first, so pay attention. How do you envision the development and implementation of low carbon energy, including renewable and nuclear sources, impacting the American economy? What role, if any, do you see for the private-public partnerships in bringing low-carbon energy sources to the market? I'm going to kick this over to Chris first.
That's not a surprise. I started off the panel. No, just kidding. But yeah, no, great question. And obviously, the whole point of tackling climate change is getting to the clean energy technologies that will get us to net zero in time to reduce the worst impacts of climate change. And I mentioned earlier that some of the statistics about the price of solar coming down 88% in the last decade, and the price of wind coming down 71%. And the reason for that is at the most basic level is because there is increased demand for those energy sources from the people that are buying them, from consumers. In my view, there's an enormous economic opportunity, especially after the whole COVID pandemic, for greater development and implementation of these clean energy sources to be a part of the American grid. And more people are realizing, and companies are realizing, that there is enormous investment opportunity for them to get involved in this. And that's why, very briefly, a few months ago, there was Next Era Energy, is a renewable-based energy company, overtook Exxon as the largest energy company by market cap. And again, there's a reason for that. It's because the market is currently rewarding that, and more projects are popping up that are developing cleaner energies and developing renewables, hydrogen, carbon capture, all kinds of different technologies. And I think that really is because the consumers are demanding it. And I think as far as possible, we should be creating competitive markets where regulations are taken out of the way for these companies, for example, allowing them to form master limited partnerships in the way that fossil fuel companies do, for them to be on an equal footing, and for consumers to be able to choose where they get their energy source from. And I think if you can, on a very basic level, on a piece of paper, choose where do you want your energy to come from between coal, natural gas, wind, renewable, nuclear, most people will probably choose renewables or nuclear, because they understand that that is what is necessary. And if you have a right regulatory environment, they are competitive with fossil fuels. And I think that's the proper way for it to be sustainably introduced into the American grid, is for companies to be directly rewarded for providing the right types of energy sources to consumers. In terms of public-private partnerships, I think obviously, from my perspective, government has to start by creating a regulatory regime that is friendly to clean energy sources. And I also think that in many ways, government can support early stage innovation for example, hydrogen and carbon capture to be a part of this solution. And so I don't at all exclude the government from playing that type of supportive role, but I think that ultimately we should be looking at competition and market forces as the way that will drive up the popularity of these solutions while driving down their costs as well.
Eric, what do you think? Do you agree with Chris? Do you think it's too simplistic?
I mean, I know this is a debate, so I'm supposed to come out swinging, but I basically agree with that. I mean, but the problem is maybe a little bit different in my view, which is that the reason we don't have competition is not because of government. It's because of the market. It's because of private sector players who then influence public policy in ways that strangle competition. So if you go out to Ohio right now, and if anybody has a few minutes to spend reading this evening, you can read about the first energy scandal that happened in 2020, where basically a utility straight up bribed with millions of dollars, several leading elected officials in that state. They were, literally marched out of their homes into jail, and it turned out that all of that was done by the gas industry and the coal industry in order to continue operating utilities in a way that favors existing fossil fuels rather than a competitive market for renewable energy. So the problem is that our systems are not working well. We've got a poisonous interaction between government and private sector actors, and we've got neither a free market nor a very effective government right now. Now, again, my belief is basically that a lot of what Chris has said, not all of it, but a lot of it is basically right, which is that we ought to, at this point in our development, really favor a sort of equalized competitive basis, especially for electricity generation, but for other things too at this point. And if we had something like that, where we were either not subsidizing or subsidizing equally, but those subsidies get complicated fast, renewable energy would take over in a heartbeat. But you really have to look at not just kind of the obvious giveaways, but the way that we treat utility policy, rail policy, pipeline regulations. NEPA is a good one. Chris and I probably disagree about the impacts of NEPA, but that one actually is worth discussing as well. I think I've probably rambled on long enough on that one, but I'm very curious to know what the others think too.
I know that Todd has written quite a bit about these issues, and I would love to hear, Todd, your reaction to Eric's comments.
Yeah, I think the challenge is that politicians who feel like they need to address climate change because it's a serious problem feel like they need to come up with the solutions. And so they are put in the position of saying, okay, I'm going to choose these things. And they are rewarded for that. And they're rewarded for it in a variety of ways. One of them is simply signaling. One of the things that I hear all the time from politicians is like, well, what you're choosing is very expensive and very risky. And what they will say is, well, that shows how serious I am. They shouldn't be judged on seriousness or image. They should be judged on results. The other thing is that it's very hard to, if we want clean energy technologies to emerge, it's very hard to choose the right one. So the state legislature has passed a law that would make it illegal to buy gas-powered vehicles after 2030. So it'd have to be only electric vehicles. But that seems reasonable, but we don't know what the timeline will be. And the best example is that in about 2002, California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia joined together so that by 2010, when the Olympics were in Vancouver, BC, there would be a hydrogen highway, which is that hydrogen-powered vehicles could travel all the way from Los Angeles to the Olympics in Vancouver, powered entirely by hydrogen. Well, here we are in 2021, we still don't have hydrogen cars. Predicting the future of technologies, of the most effective technologies, is very difficult. Another example is what's called cellulosic ethanol. When I worked at the State Department of Natural Resources in the early 2000s, we looked at how to use wood slash, the wood that was left over from timber, and turn it into fuels. And we thought this is going to be, something that's viable in the near future. Cellulosic ethanol is actually mandated by the federal government as part of the Farm Bureau. But every year the EPA waives the rule because there's basically no cellulosic ethanol. It's not a fault of politicians for not being able to predict the future. None of us can. It is the fault of people thinking that they can. And so it's a very unsatisfactory answer that people who believe in free markets give when we're asked, how are you going to get us from here to there? Because what we say is it's hard to say. We should let competition, we should let lots of people try lots of different things. It is much more comforting to say we're going to mandate a hydrogen highway or cellulosic ethanol or electric vehicles because it feels better. But in the end, that takes us off track. It takes us in the wrong direction. It puts our focus in the wrong place. Meanwhile, markets are coming up with new solutions. That is not as tangible, but we do see that it works. And in fact, the evidence that it works is that where we are in the United States today in terms of CO2 emissions is actually lower than if we had adopted the cap and trade proposal from 2009. Markets find a way to be more efficient. It's messy, it's unpredictable, but we get there.
Thank you, Todd. Steve, your thoughts? You're on mute, Steve. You knew it happened.
On what Chris said about the cost of wind and solar coming way, way down over the last 10 years. That's really great. And so now they can provide cheap, carbon-free electricity, but only when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. And so there are people that talk about we can produce all our electricity with water, wind, and solar. But wow, when the sun isn't shining, wind isn't blowing, then how do you meet our electricity needs? You have to fill in those gaps, and so we need some way of storage, and storage can be very expensive. Just using batteries, it's extremely expensive, and so to fill in those gaps, the utilities are adding gas turbines, and gas is pretty cheap, but it is a fossil fuel. And so the other alternative is nuclear production, and the fourth generation nuclear reactors can fill in those gaps, but they have to be cost competitive with the natural gas, and that's where the carbon price comes in. Initially, the carbon price is low, and gas is going to be cheaper than nuclear power. But over time, as the carbon price increases, and nuclear power becomes more competitive, and that will fill in the gaps when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. But government, in addition to the price on carbon, the government can play a role in reducing barriers to transmitting electricity from source regions to regions with high demand. It should prohibit utilities from blocking use of transmission lines via carbon-free production sources. This is actually happening. And it should promptly approve underground as well as overhead transmission in corridors such as interstate highways and rail right-of-ways. Transmission lines is the big problem, getting those approved, and government can play a role in expediting that. And then, of course, government can play a role in sponsoring R&D on storage technology to subsidize the most promising methods until they're scalable and competitive.
Thank you, Steve. Our next question is going to be one from the audience. The question is, one of the criticisms of decentralizing environmental policy is that the competition among states and localities may motivate political factors to reduce environmental regulation to gain a competitive advantage. What would be a happy medium so there's not a race to the bottom in any kind of effort toward environmental policy? I'd love Todd to take this one first.
Yeah, it's a challenge. And that's why I think one reason that I think Seattle and Spokane and other cities are failing to meet their CO2 targets is that setting a citywide CO2 target in the first place is sort of silly because they don't control a lot of what goes on, the driving, because they can only control what happens within the city limits. There are things that they can do, but I think as the person who asked the question points out, that there are lots of things out of their control. And if the neighboring jurisdiction does something different, then, those policies can actually become counterproductive. And one area that you see this is what it's called energy intensive trade exposed industries, where the current climate policy that we're examining in Washington State actually exempts, well, it doesn't anymore. They keep fighting about it, but how much to exempt what are called energy intensive trade exposed industries, concrete production, aluminum production that uses a lot of energy, emits a lot of CO2, but could move other parts of the world. So yes, that's a problem. And so you want to make your policy as uniform and as widespread as possible to avoid that. But it is a reality. That is going to happen. And so what you need to do, that's why the stick can't be the only policy. You have to encourage more efficiency. You have to use those market forces so that there is a benefit to becoming more energy efficient. Fuel has costs, energy has costs, and there are two ways to make those costs felt. One is the way Steve's talking about, which is to raise the price so that people feel the impact of the cost on carbon more. But the other way, the way that we neglect is to increase our ability to respond to those prices. The reason right now that individuals pay basically the same for electricity at 3 o'clock and at 7 o'clock, even though utilities don't, is because we have a hard time responding to those immediate price signals for electricity, right? Nobody even knows. But if we can give you technology like Nest thermostats that allows you to respond more, then you don't have to raise the price very extremely high. You can use the existing prices and therefore disincentivize people moving to other jurisdictions and getting into the fight, the jurisdictional fight that the person who asked the question is talking about.
Thank you, Todd. And Steve, you were mentioned. Would you care to respond?
Yeah. So what that question is asking about is carbon leakage from one region that imposes some sort of a climate policy, and then businesses relocate to a place without a climate policy. And in my mind, the solution to that is a federal policy. So you don't have leakage from one state to another. It's a uniform policy across the nation. And then at the federal level, you can impose a border adjustment. States cannot regulate international trade, but the nation can. And that's really the way to prevent the carbon leakage from one country to another. So that's why I support this national federal policy with border adjustments.
Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and kind of it's part of the age-old American balance between federal power and state power, and some of the regulations that I talked about earlier and that are very burdensome and hinder clean energy projects are federal regulations, and obviously that's something that needs to be reformed. And I in many ways I do see federal regulation as being a big part of the problem for clean energy projects. One of the reasons why I tend to like decentralized regulatory approaches or policy approaches is because it creates this, as much as some people might argue it creates a race to the bottom, I think it also creates kind of a laboratory of change. And that means that different places can experiment with different climate policies. And if you have a particular state that says we want a competitive energy market with very low regulation for clean energy projects, and then all of a sudden all the clean energy companies flock to that state to build more projects there, and because the economic opportunity is there, then all of a sudden all the other states will be like, oh wait, there seems to be a huge economic boom for clean energy in this state, so we will also make it easier to develop these clean energy projects. And I think as much as Steve talks about the carbon price, I think there are many other problems in the way of clean energy projects right now, such as the regulations I talked about, and allowing states to repeal some of those regulations and make it easier at the local level would give, first of all, allow them the economic opportunity for these projects to get off the ground, but also make it that other states would look at that and be like, actually, this is a good policy. I want to implement this too. So I really think there are opportunities for decentralized and state climate policies that could really provide that incentive for others to do the same.
Thank you, Chris. Eric, what do you think? Are we in a race to the bottom or a laboratory of change when it comes to environmental policy?
I don't know. I like the laboratory of innovation or something like that. I like that idea. You know, it's not clear to me. I mean, in some ways, this is a question that felt like it really had teeth 10 or 20 years ago. It's not clear to me that it really does anymore. I mean, you know, if climate policy really drove business and innovation away, everyone would be in West Virginia, right? But they're not. And the reason for that is that well, there are a whole bunch of reasons for things like that. But a lot of the places, the leadership cities like King County and Seattle and Washington State, and the places that Todd gets rather grumpy about, actually are flourishing. You know, they're not perfect. There are lots of structural problems with the economics, I would argue. But, you know, in general, they're doing pretty well. There are some other places that are pretty invested in fossil fuels. Texas is one that is also doing pretty well. So it's not really clear that there's a real risk to this. If anything, it could be that clean energy and climate policy is actually enhancing and driving more job growth and more economic growth than the reverse. And, you know, one example of that actually is, I think Chris made a really good point in his opening remarks. There are a lot of flagship corporations, certainly not all of them, but a lot of the flagship Northwest corporations have very aggressive climate policies. I've written about it some myself. You can nitpick and do maybe a little bit more than nitpick with some of them. They really prefer to locate and have their workforce located in places that are pursuing a responsible approach to climate. So there's a way in which there's a direct sort of economic advantage to it. But I guess, you know, since I'm supposed to be in this debate to sort of play the role of the you know, the pro-government command and control guy, you know, I will say, the one thing that I think maybe is getting slightly lost in the discussion, and I'll own my share of it, is that we have a big problem with climate change, right? We have CO2 emissions that far exceed what our sort of carbon budget is relative to actually achieving science-based reduction targets. So we've got a huge problem, and we've got to figure out as some kind of public policy measure, what do we do about that? Now, if you just dismiss the fact that climate change is real or something, then that's a different conversation. But in as much as you believe that climate change is real, we've got this huge problem in front of us. And so at some level, some unit of government, ideally the federal government, would set something like uniform policy. I believed this 20 years ago that was going to happen. 10 years ago, I even sort of believed it. In my advanced age, I'm quickly losing faith that will happen. And so a lot of the kind of aspirational approach to public policy seems a little bit like fantasy to me. And what we have right now is this incredibly messy patchwork of regulatory approaches, a very divided political system, a market that includes millions of actors who are going, in every conceivable direction, many of which are directly opposed to one another. And so what we have to do is kind of like in golf, you got to play it where it lies. And what we are dealing with is a sprawling hot mess of regulatory and market-based approaches. And so I would prefer to identify the places where we can drive climate change causing things away and encourage the growth of innovation in clean energy and Nest thermostats and all the rest of it. So that's kind of where I'll end my remarks for now.
And so, Eric, you joined this debate, kind of talking about how you were excited that we're getting together to talk about this issue. Can you kind of share with us, Eric, what approaches do you think your policy does to engage the other side, or do you think that's important?
I mean, it is critically important because to the extent that we're going to have any policy, whether it's environmental policy or something else that's durable, we have got to figure out how to have support that's more than 51% of the population. And right now, I think it's abundantly obvious to everyone in this country, no matter which side you're on, we are extremely divided right now. And there's not a huge amount that we agree on, unfortunately. But there are some things. And actually, clean energy tends to be one of them. It's pretty darn popular to install. I mean, people, and I think Todd and Chris have both made this point well, would sort of prefer, all else being equal, to have abundant, low-cost, clean energy rather than a dirty, polluting source of energy. And so if we can, if there are things like that. Now, there's other stuff that is also pretty popular that I think we are seeing some real evolution on, in my opinion. And one of those, and I'll, candidly, is stuff that I work on a lot with my own sort of professional career, which is getting people to clearly identify the manifest harms of fossil fuels, some of which are related to the climate and many of which are not. So we've had a debate in this region, I think maybe Todd and I mixed it up over this some years ago over coal trains and oil trains and petrochemical developments and a bunch of other stuff. And most communities, it turns out, when confronted with the scale of fossil fuel development that is proposed, don't want it. They don't want it at all. And what we saw springing up in places that didn't have really much connection at all to the environmental movement, Hoquiam's a great example of this, where just organically local communities, when confronted with the possibility of having 10 or 20 oil trains a day roll through town, will quickly move to chart a different course for their future. And I think that's really positive. And I think in that are the seeds of a sort of broader agreement, probably not consensus, but a broader agreement about a climate responsible approach.
Thank you, Eric. And Todd was mentioned, so I'll give this one to you. How will your policy, Todd, engage moderates and those on the other side? And of course, being a center director for a nonpartisan organization is a great place to start. Would you mind commenting?
So I deal with, as someone on the center right who says that there is risk from climate change, I get to deal with people on both sides who think I'm crazy. I get to deal with conservatives who say that climate change is a Trojan horse for a lot of big government policies. There are times when I believe that, actually, but they also think that climate change is exaggerated or phony. So how do I reach that person? And the way I reach that person is I say, look, would you like to spend less money on energy and electricity? And they say yes. And I say, look, it doesn't matter whether you believe in climate change or you don't, but if we can do something that helps you respond to energy prices better and spend less, they're going to do it. And so we have to engage them and empower them that way. I think too often on environmental policies, what we do is that we sort of bludgeon people to tell them, look, You need to do this for the good of humanity or for the good of this. And people, I don't respond to that very well to that way. I am an iconoclast. I live in King County and I'm on the center right. If I wasn't, rebellious, I would not survive very long here. So when people tell me you should do this for the good of whomever, I react badly, like many of my other folks on the right. So you can't reach them that way, but you can reach them with incentives. On the left, what I tell people is that Eric is a perfect example of somebody that I talk to on the left, which is, okay, you may have faith that government can do more to solve this problem than I do, but do you think we're making that progress? And a lot of them say, no, I'm frustrated. I say, okay, so let's keep slugging it out on the larger policy issues, which we may never agree on. But until then, let's do these incremental things that work. Let's focus on these technologies. Let's focus on these improvements. And they often agree. Now, what they don't think is that it's fast enough, right? They sound a lot like Eric, which is that it's very serious and we have to do it and we have to get to these targets very rapidly, 50% reduction by 2030. That, I think, is where we disagree, but we can still disagree in that and still say, let's make the progress that we can make that is in front of us using technology and personal incentives and empowerment. So that is where I think that these solutions can appeal to people across the spectrum. People may disagree about whether they are fast enough or too fast or whatever else, but everybody can agree that these are things that we should do and that they're opportunities and we should support them.
Steve, do you agree, or are we bludgeoning people in Washington with our environmental policy?
Well, Washington is, I'm more of a moderate. I call myself a moderate left. And so I like to think that the carbon fee and dividend policy appeals across the political spectrum. It appeals to conservatives because it uses the power of the market to drive down emissions. It minimizes the growth of government and preserves individual choice. And I like to think it appeals to progressives because it allows the carbon price to rise high enough to achieve ambitious emissions reduction targets. And because a dividend protects the poor who are least able to reduce their emissions. And I think moderates can like the policy because it's simple, predictable, transparent, applies to all carbon emissions throughout the economy, and it's difficult to game. And I think everyone appreciates its benefits for health and personal finances and jobs and the economy. So I'm less discouraged about the prospect for an ambitious climate policy. I think carbon fee and dividend policy is well positioned to work very well at the federal level and really drive things down.
Thank you, Steve. Finally, Chris, to what extent do you think your policy preferences engage moderates and those on the other side of the aisle? And how do you think, or do you think that this is important to a sustainable and long-lasting policy?
Yeah, I mean, before I joined this debate, I wasn't entirely sure what to expect because I have engaged in debates between kind of the right and the left on these issues, and they've been a lot more acrimonious. And you've had I've encountered people more on the left that just say capitalism is by default evil and markets are by default evil, and conservatives and libertarians only care about money and they don't care about the planet. And obviously, once you reach that kind of debate, there's really no debate. And tonight's been probably more a fascinating discussion than a debate because there has been some good overlap of agreement. And like Eric said a few times, some of the things that I've said, he resonated with him and he agreed with them. And both Steve and Eric have mentioned the importance of markets as part of the solution, and they just see a role for government to work with that as well. And so what we focus a lot on at the American Conservation Coalition is we come at it partly from this political perspective, what can actually work, not just in theory, not just in an ideal world, but what can work right now. And that's why focusing on things like regulatory streamlining, it tends to be popular. I mean, both the right hates regulations and the left wants clean energy to become more abundant. And one of the ways to do that is to make regulations more streamlined, to reduce permitting, to allow these projects to come off the ground. And that's why both Eric and Steve expressed agreement with the need to make those regulations better. And there are other areas of climate policy that I think can appeal very well across the aisle, and it's critical that they do. And one of the areas, for example, is natural solutions. Over 90% of Americans, regardless of their political leaning, believe that we should be planting more trees to tackle climate change. And that's not particularly controversial. So that's a solution that we should be focusing on now. And the issue with, from my perspective, is as much as there's a lot of theoretical merit to, for example, a carbon price, there just doesn't seem to be much movement on that politically and congressionally. And sure, you have the American Petroleum Institute and economists and these people on the fringes of the political debate that are coming out in favor of it. But the reality is that both progressives and conservatives in government are not ready to embrace it. And I think my perspective as policy director is really focusing on what are political opportunities. And the moment is apparently not right now to look at a carbon price, but potentially to look at regulatory streamlining. How can we make clean energy more competitive? How can we create a more equal playing field for these technologies and give people, empower people to pursue them themselves, and for the market to do what is best? And so I think there has clearly been shown tonight that there is overlap on that. And I think we should be looking at those low-hanging fruits and looking at the political opportunities that we can implement right now, rather than just looking towards the theoretical policies that we should be implementing, but that might not actually be possible. So I think that we tonight has shown that there is some overlap on things that we can do. And I think let's start there and then take it to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you. This next question really coming from the audience. While politicians may not agree, Chris, do you think environmentalism has become trendy? And what are your thoughts on the Green New Deal?
Well, you can probably predict my thoughts on the second part of that question, but for the first part, yeah, I mean, environmentalism has become incredibly trendy to the point that millions of young people are kind of have been before COVID in the streets protesting about this issue. You have companies that are constantly updating their environmental guidances and being proud about the fact that they source their resources sustainably and things like that. And that really is the power of consumers in a market economy, is that when consumers can show their preference for something, and in this case, environmentalism and tackling climate change is an incredibly popular issue, companies will respond to that, and they have been, and that's why these amazing technologies with artificial intelligence, et cetera, are coming out of the market to respond to that. When it comes to the Green New Deal, to kind of echo what Todd was saying earlier, I do really think the Green New Deal is a Trojan horse for a lot of progressive policies that have nothing to do with climate change. I mean, the Green New Deal, somebody did an analysis of it, and then for every single word that it talks about climate change, it has about 8 or 9 words talking about healthcare and free college and job guarantees and all those kinds of things, which actually have nothing to do with climate change. And I think if we're talking about building bridges and coming up with bipartisan solutions, that is the last thing that we can do and should do. And that's why many conservatives have been turned off in this debate and have been unwilling to engage, because in their eyes, they equate climate policy with the Green New Deal. And if we want conservatives to be part of this solution, as Eric said, if we want durable policy, then we should be rallying around the policies that can actually work, rather than just coming up with wish lists and using climate change as an excuse for them.
Thanks, Chris. And Todd, you've written quite extensively about the effects of environmentalism becoming trendy and the market solutions that emerge from that. Can you comment on those and definitely touch on your thoughts about the Green New Deal?
Yeah, I think the challenge for politicians, like I said, who feel like they're in a position where they should come up with the solutions, is that the vast majority of politicians are not climate scientists. They are not engineers. They are not economists. And yet they are being asked to make decisions and predict the future of all of those areas. So politicians, because they don't have those skills, what politicians do know, though, very well is how to get elected. They know what's popular. They know what appeals to the public. That's why they got elected. And so when push comes to shove, when they are trying to decide what the best route is and how they do things, they go back to what they are comfortable with, which is determining what is popular. But the relationship between what is popular and what is effective in environmental policy generally and on climate change is not always one-to-one. In fact, it is rarely one-to-one. So when you're asking people who don't have feedback, who are not held accountable for failure of policy to make decisions, they make decisions on what is most comfortable to them, and that is what is trendy and what is popular. And that's why I think that leads us in the wrong direction. That's why I'm also really frustrated when people talk about the climate crisis. If you tell somebody they have a crisis mentality, that's not a compliment. And what often you hear from people who say we have a climate crisis is we can't wait. The way that gets translated, I understand that what they say is that the problem, what they mean to say is that the problem is urgent. But the way that gets translated is we don't have time to think. We just need to do something. And that I think is a very bad way to do policy. And I think that's part of why we're failing to meet our targets, is because we choose policies in a hurry based on a crisis mentality, based on what's popular rather than what's effective. Let me just say one last thing. I think one big area that Eric and I and maybe Steve disagree is the nature of the problem. Science informs the risks that we have from climate change. There's no doubt about it. We have to use that science. And I generally, when I talk about, when people ask me, what do you think the likely scenarios are, I basically turn to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They have a range of projections, but I say, okay, that's a reasonable range. What I don't think, though, is that targets of 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius, which we have in Washington State, are science. That is a fundamentally economic question. And let me explain that. If it costs us $1 to meet the 2 degrees Celsius target, we would do it. I would hand you the dollar. If it cost $100 trillion to reach 2 degrees Celsius, we would never do it because the cost would be too high. What changed there is not the science. What changed there is the cost, the economic cost. So it's a fundamentally economic question. And so that's why I turn to people like William Nordhaus, who won the Nobel Prize in 2018 for his climate modeling about what the appropriate target is, about what we can reasonably achieve, where the costs outweigh the benefits. And he says 1.5 degrees Celsius is not even a reasonable target because the costs so outweigh the benefits. I think as long as you keep that mindset, that doesn't say that climate change isn't real. It says, no, it's real, we need to address it. But I think it takes a more appropriate approach to dealing with it so that you don't fall into a crisis mentality and you don't turn to trendy rather than effective approaches.
Perfect. Thanks, Todd. Eric, would love your comments.
I've got comments. I think there's a certain level of inaccuracy, I think, in what Todd said. I'm going to take the gloves off just a little bit, which is that he keeps talking about politicians as if there's this sort of monolithic class of political actors out there who have distorted incentives. But it is quite true that there have been politicians who have set aspirational climate targets, and then for various reasons, the jurisdiction that they represent has failed to achieve those targets. That's absolutely right. The question is, ought they to be faulted for setting those aspirational targets and for trying to drive public policy in a direction that would achieve those targets? Or is there some subset of politicians who don't take climate targets seriously at all, who support fossil fuel subsidies, who obstruct any means of taking away fossil fuel subsidies, who love market distortions in as much as it disadvantages climate responsible behavior and advantages incumbent actors in the market? We need to make some differentiation, some distinctions about who's doing what, because it's not as if there's a single sort of class of actors called politicians who do it. I'm pretty sure that there's actually a robust political disagreement in this country. And if you were to go to Washington, D.C. and ask people, do you support removing subsidies for fossil fuels? About half in the House would say yes, and about half would say no. And I bet we could come up with a political distinction that would map almost exactly to that. So that's one thing I wanted to address. The other thing I think that's worth talking about too is this notion that environmentalism is trendy, and I suppose it's trendy. I guess it must be like the least effective trend of all time. But it's cool that some people think that it's trendy. I certainly think it's trendy to like clean air and clean water. I hope that trend sort of continues and grows. But I also think it's cool to have a job and have income, and there are lots of things that are trendy in that sense. And I guess maybe the last thing, the last remark I'll make is about the Green New Deal. And I guess, now that we're sort of getting into the fun part of the debate, I guess I fundamentally disagree with Chris's characterization of the GND as a Trojan horse. It's not a Trojan horse. It is simply progressive policy. It's a big, long list of progressive policies, many of which I agree with. I don't agree with everything in there, but Chris is absolutely right that it's about a lot more than climate, and that's of course accurate. It is about a ton more than climate. It's about healthcare and worker supports, and there's a whole debate to have about basic income, universal basic income, and so forth. And we can go kind of on down the list. It turns out that a lot of that stuff is extremely popular. Like if you were to sort of set aside this mysterious class of actors called politicians and talk to people about whether they support free or low cost healthcare, universal basic income, banning fossil fuel subsidies, maybe banning fossil fuels altogether, you get shockingly high levels of support for this stuff. And I'll wrap up with just one example because I think it really touches on the nature of the sort of political division that underlies a lot of this, which is public opinion research in Pennsylvania. I spend way too much of my life thinking about public opinion in Pennsylvania. I won't bother you with the reasons for that, but I've studied it more intensely than is probably good for a person. As everyone knows, both presidential campaigns were in Pennsylvania about every 5 minutes, and they were screaming about, we're going to ban fracking, we're not going to ban fracking, he's going to ban fracking. And that was the nature of the debate. If you actually survey Pennsylvania voters, like the actual ones who vote, who went to the polls, banning fracking is kind of popular. And the Democrats did terribly in Pennsylvania. They won one big race in Pennsylvania. That was they got Joe Biden barely over the line for the electoral votes in Pennsylvania. They lost every other statewide race, and they lost control of the state legislature in Pennsylvania. They won one other statewide race, and that was Attorney General Josh Shapiro. Josh Shapiro is a full-throated antagonist to the fracking industry. And in the fracking counties where that's happening, he outperformed Biden dramatically. And so what happens is we have these debates going on about fossil fuels, for example, and public opinion is actually pretty dramatically, I would say, on not all of these issues, but many of them kind of on my side, which is that people don't want this stuff anymore. And this class of people, these politicians that I keep hearing about, are misunderstanding where public opinion is. And the reason that they're misunderstanding that is not an accident. As Todd said, they're actually pretty good at getting elected. But because there are distorting forces from the fossil fuel industry, from incumbent actors, from a market and government that's wrapped all around each other in a rat's nest. And with that, I'll kind of shut up because I suppose a few folks are going to want to take a crack at that too.
Well, Steve, we have yet to ask you this question. Green New Deal, trendy or sound policy?
Ooh, lots of grist for the meal to work with on this one. Well, first of all, I have to say that I think characterizing the angst that the millennials and Gen Z people feel about climate change as trendy, I think is really a disservice to them. I think they are the generation that is vested in the climate of the future. And I think they care very deeply about this issue, and they're going to be a political force. And I think they're really driving a lot of the success that we've had in implementing climate action. So Green New Deal, this nation has a problem with income inequality. And I think, my liberal side says, cutting taxes isn't going to increase demand for American products. It's, people having a living wage is more valuable for that. But frankly, on the other hand, my conservative side says, or actually my climate scientist side says, I am suspicious of people using climate change as a reason to attack issues like income inequality. Yeah, there are some connections, certainly, but I feel like climate change issue has been hijacked by some people, and requiring us to solve all the problems of the world to solve climate change is really making things all the more difficult. So I really don't like the Green New Deal myself either. I also want to touch on Nordhaus. Todd mentioned Nordhaus and the Nobel Prize in Economics for arguing that there's an optimal climate policy that will prevent the most damage at the lowest cost to society. But that conclusion is correct, but I think Nordhaus underestimated the climate impacts. He did not consider sea level rise and health issues as well. But so I think qualitatively he's correct, but I think his estimate of the warming that we should allow is too high. That he underestimated the damage that more warming will cause. So there's that.
All right, thanks. So for this,
can I very quickly respond to one of Eric's points?
Please.
Just as a bit of context, I mean, I am by no means an expert, but I did take public polling and statistics as part of my undergrad degree, and it gave me a very healthy skepticism of public polling. If you look, for example, yes, the vast majority of Americans support on public polling a Green New Deal, but when you actually start telling them what that Green New Deal would look like, they become a lot less enthusiastic. And just a very good example of this is that 68% of Americans would be unwilling to pay $10 more a month on their electric bill to address climate change. How are they going to underwrite a trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars Green New Deal if they're even unwilling to pay $10 extra a month to stop climate change? And I think it's very easy for people to say they support something or not, but when the rubber meets the road and they actually would have to pay for it, and their taxes would rise and their energy bills would rise, and it would be a lot more expensive for their families, then I don't think they'd be that happy about a Green New Deal. So I just want to put a bit of context around kind of trusting public polling.
Appreciate you jumping in there, Chris. So we're getting close to the end here. I have one rapid fire question for each of you. Chris, we're going to start with you, and actually everyone will have the same question to keep it fair. If there is one policy, environmental policy that is, that you really believe in, could you briefly describe what that might be?
Yeah, give me a few seconds to gather my thoughts on that one.
I can go first, so Chris will have more time.
We know your answer, Steve, but go for it.
Well, I mean, you've already heard it, carbon fee and dividend. Okay, enough.
You're on mute.
Oh, Steve just asked if for 30 seconds you could describe again what that policy is.
Carbon fee and dividend puts a price on carbon and increases steadily over time. And all the revenue is collected and immediately returned to the economy in the form of an equal monthly dividend to all legal residents. There's also a border adjustment to protect international trade by putting a price on imports from countries without an equivalent price on carbon. Revenue from that is given to our exporters of energy-intensive trade-exposed goods.
Nicely done. Thank you. Todd?
So I don't know if there is a perfect policy. So I will tell you what the policy I think we should adopt in Washington state right now is. And that is that we should take money that we use to subsidize things like electric vehicle charging stations, solar power, which is remarkably inefficient in Washington State, one of the worst places in the country, and put that into basically a competitive grant program, and say, come up with your best ways to reduce CO2 emissions, and whoever can do the most for the least price, we will give money to. There is already a system for doing this. It's the system I use to become carbon neutral. I invest in projects that are a very low price. The concern that I have about trendiness is that we fall for things that sound good, but aren't, like installing EV stations. I don't mean to say, and I don't say, that environmental concerns are trendy. I just want to make sure that the money doesn't go to trendy ways to try to address that basic problem. And I think taking the money that we are wasting now and putting it into a competitive grant program where you can get the most for the least cost would be a great policy.
Great. Eric, do you have something you can chime in?
Absolutely. I think that we've got, as I've said multiple times, a rat's nest of entangled market and government problems right now. The simplest way to address that from a climate perspective, I love Steve's idea, but I don't think it's politically possible or even close to it. So what I think we should do is we should ban the expansion of fossil fuels in all their forms, no more new fossil fuels of any kind right now, and then we should figure out a way to physically dismantle the infrastructure that delivers fossil fuels over the next 10 to 20, 30 years. That is not a super great market approach. It's not a super great public policy approach. It's also very effective, and it would allow us to take our hands off so many other things. And after we set those guide rails in place, we would reduce 80 to 90% of our climate emissions, let the market run free, let Todd, buy a Rex and install Nest thermostats, and Chris can install some wind farms. And but as long as we have got the basic incentives right, which is outline the overriding source of our climate crisis, then we don't have to worry about all that much after that. So I would basically take the blunt force approach of banning fossil fuels, but over a scheduled sort of phase out period.
Okay, Chris, back to you.
I've had time to gather my thoughts. So, I mean, I like Todd's idea. I think that's a great idea. And similar to Eric, I do actually think that Steve's idea is good, but just politically impossible at the moment. But predictably, I don't like Eric's idea. So I would probably say that because I live in DC and I come from this at a politically feasible angle, I would say as much as possible, creating a fully competitive energy market where we reduce regulations, where we don't give unfair advantages to fossil fuels, we remove fossil fuel subsidies. And as Eric said, that yes, in such a scenario, wind and solar and other renewable and clean energy sources would win because they would be more competitive than fossil fuels. And I think creating that competitive marketplace for that would really do a lot to allow these projects to come off the ground. And if you look at Texas, for example, which is like considered a huge fossil fuel state, which it is, but it's also, if it were a country, would be the 5th largest producer of wind energy in the world. Why? Because that is a very competitive energy market, and wind is a very profitable and attractive business venture for energy companies in the state. And so I think creating that level playing field would be the best way to do it. And I will give a particular shout out to nuclear there, because the regulatory framework around nuclear is absolutely ridiculous. And we cannot get to net zero without nuclear energy, in my opinion. We need renewables, but we also need nuclear massively and quickly. And we should really reform our regulatory system around nuclear to make it a lot easier to build projects. I mean, sometimes they're delayed by over 10 years and billions of dollars in extra costs just to build a project. And I think if we can accelerate that and support next generation nuclear energy, that would be a really good way to get cheap, quick, affordable, reliable, clean energy.
Wonderful. Really want to thank the audience for contributing your questions this evening. We're going to wrap up with some closing remarks. I'm going to go in reverse order that I did for introductions. So Eric, if you could go first and give us your about a 1-minute summation, closing statement, please.
Oh gosh. Well, I'll start where I began, or I'll end where I began. I appreciate the opportunity to have this debate. I think it's fun. I think it's illuminating in some ways. I do think that there is a lot we need to do to confront and identify clearly the source of our climate problem. The source of our climate problem is unambiguously the burning of fossil fuels. There are other contributors too, which are worth paying attention to, but we've got to put that squarely in the center of our target. That's the bullseye, is how do we eliminate the climate emissions that come from burning fossil fuels. And so if that is at the center of our target, then what that yields, in my opinion, is a series of strategies to figure out how to reduce the burning of fossil fuels. Lots of ways you can go at that through a market-based mechanism like Steve is describing, by eliminating subsidies like Chris is describing. I think both of those, frankly, are completely politically impossible, although I support them. I think they're great ideas. And I think that unfortunately, because we have such a tangled morass, the only way we're going to be able to cut through that is to go to, not in sort of a clever, indirect way, but to go directly at the problem, state clearly that the climate emergency is caused by burning fossil fuels. And so then we will just figure out some ways to make them go away. And we can do that, luckily, with a regulatory fiat. Boom, problem solved, and we all can go on our way. And with that, I'll thank you again. I really have appreciated this debate. It's fun to get to mix it up with some folks who don't agree with me. I wish I did it more often.
That's great. We appreciate having you, Eric. Thank you. Todd, would you give us a wrap up, please?
Yeah, well, and I also have enjoyed this. And this is why when we were thinking about putting this together, I chose the folks that I did, because I know they disagree with me, but that doesn't put them off, unlike too many, I think, of our discussions these days about other people. Look, I've worked in government. I used to work at the State Department of Natural Resources. I currently sit on a government panel for salmon recovery. I understand government's role, and I support it, and I'm very proud of the work that I did in both of those government roles. But I also see the limitations. I saw the pressures on the politicians and the people who worked in those agencies, and the incentives that I thought were not always aligned with good results. And the beauty is that I think we now live in an age where technology is more able to do things than it ever was before. In the 1970s, a lot of things, cleaning up the air, cleaning up the water, could not have been done in the way that I am advocating now. I think only the EPA, only the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act could have achieved the goals that it achieved, because it was a different time, it was a different type of problem, and we had different technologies. Today, because we have powerful personal technologies, we can do those things. And I think we need to change our mindset. So it is not that I am against government, but I just think that the challenges that we face and the technology and opportunities we have are different, and we ought to focus on them and take that opportunity. And I think that's the way we're going to be most effective.
Wonderful. Thanks, Todd. Steve, can you give us a 1-minute closing statement, please?
Sure. I'll just return to what those economists had said. A carbon tax offers the most cost-effective lever to reduce carbon emissions at the scale and speed that is necessary. And the dividend makes it politically palatable. You guys may not think so, but it's like too often I hear people, they're very well aware of a tax, but they don't understand the dividend. And that's really what we're emphasizing, is the dividend. And then the border adjustment will motivate domestic manufacturing to stay, and other countries to also price carbon. I'll summarize the three benefits of carbon dividends. The funds go directly into the economy rather than growing government. They protect the poor, for whom carbon fees are a larger fraction of their income, and then compensate everyone. We're all victims of climate change, whether directly from climate impacts or indirectly through the shared burden of higher insurance premiums to pay for health impacts or life insurance, or of higher taxes to pay for disaster relief. There's no other single climate policy that can be effective as a carbon fee and dividend in reducing carbon dioxide emissions, and uses incentives to drive innovation and gives consumers choices, and protects 99% of the poorest quintile in income, keeps government small, and protects our international trade. I urge you to join Citizens Climate Lobby, help get its legislation through Congress. This is the year to do it.
Lobby, you did. Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it. All right, Chris, wrap us up. Bring us home.
Sure. I'll quickly just recap my general points and then make a broader cultural point. About my general points, for a very long time, and still we have a structural impediment that or a structure, a regulatory structure that incentivizes fossil fuels and makes it harder for clean energy projects to emerge. And I think even if we were to ban fossil fuels tomorrow, that does not change the fact that it takes sometimes over a decade for a clean energy project to come off the ground. And I think that is where we have to really go to the root of the problem to make sure that these projects are able to happen and that they aren't being held up by pointless red tape. And I mean, you've heard my arguments throughout the night, so I won't just keep hammering on about that. But I want to end on a kind of positive cultural note. Obviously, I'm a conservative. The organization I work for, the American Conservation Coalition, represents conservatives at over 200 college campuses across the country. And there are probably a lot of people on this call that are not conservative. And I just want to tell you as a young conservative that this is one of the issues I care the most about. And I deeply love the environment. And it's an issue that I want to see solved. And I, as someone that will have to live on this planet for hopefully a long time into the future, I want to solve this problem. And I want to rally with the fellow young people that care about this to do something about it. So conservatives have not been good on this issue. They've not led on this issue, but I promise that what we are trying to do is to hold them accountable and to bring them to the table and to have these kind of constructive debates as we have had tonight to make sure that all voices are heard and that we can come up with the best, most sustainable solutions to the problem.
Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate that. And thank you again to all of our panelists. I'm going to turn it over to Marissa now.
Thank you so much, Maya, and thank you, just a tremendous thank you to everyone who's taken time out of your evening to join us for this event. Thank you to our panelists for such an excellent, robust, and above all else, respectful discussion. I'm so grateful for being able to do this event with you. And thank you to our partner, TVW, for broadcasting it. Thank you to the Gonzaga YP Club for hosting it. And once again, a thank you to everyone who has joined us. If you would like access to more events like this, if you want to join a dynamic and diverse community here in Washington State, again, please consider joining or renewing a membership with the WPC Young Professionals, and check us out on Instagram if you get a chance. But yes, once more over, thank you to everyone, panelists, moderators, GUYPs, audience, TVW, and have an excellent rest of your evening. Thank you.